Welcome to the Storytelling That Sticks for Business and Life podcast. I'm your keynote, TED Talk and story coach, Doug Stevenson. In this podcast series, I'm going to share with you some simple and practical storytelling techniques and hacks that will make you stand out from the competition so that you can get paid to speak, or to give a TED Talk that goes viral, or to simply tell your story in a way that makes a difference in the world. My job as your virtual keynote and story coach is to help you design and deliver stories and speeches that get people to do what you want them to do, or to consider a new perspective. If you're serious about using storytelling to advance your career, to get paid to speak, or simply to get your message across in a more engaging and compelling manner, this podcast is for you. All right, well, let's get started.
Lisa McInnes-Smith began speaking in 1985. She discovered that she had a purpose to serve others and a passion to help teenagers. This passion led to her writing a book titled Why Wasn't I Told? For teenagers and young adults. The book led to her speaking at high school assemblies and at public seminars in large country towns all over Australia. Lisa recalls setting a goal to reach 1 million teenagers in her lifetime, and once the media caught wind of her speaking tour, they gave her the publicity she needed to reach her goal. Well, it didn't take her a lifetime. It only took 8.5 years. But you know what happens when you do a great job with kids? They go home and tell their parents. And so the school assemblies eventually opened the door into the corporate market. The turning point in Lisa's career came when she realized that she didn't need to tell anyone else's stories, that her personal experiences were valuable learning tools for other people. So, she began to draw out the lessons from her own stories that deeply impacted her life. Lisa feels that it is her vulnerability, honesty, and transparency with her audiences that builds a genuine connection with them and allows people to identify with her and apply her lessons in their lives. I sat down with Lisa in Sydney, Australia, to pick her pockets for a few gold nuggets of speaking and storytelling wisdom, and she was more than happy to oblige. Can you tell me a little bit about some of your signature stories and how they became signature stories?
I have probably 4 major signature stories. One is because I was born with my left eye permanently closed, so the story's called Bung Eye. One of the stories came out of me attending an NSA function a long time ago, and there was a fundraising night, and we had a hula hooping competition. I realised this is a skill that I'm really good at, and it's also part of my active, energetic persona and my phys ed background. And so I started to use a whole hula hooping scenario into my presentations. So I'm often known as the hula hoop lady. And then there's another one. It's called the pin, the diamond pin. I'm not going to give you too much detail on that, but I'm called the pin lady. And that one probably has lasted me 20 years. And wherever I go, people say, please don't forget to do the pin. And the last one is the boomerang lady, because I had an actual experience where I threw a boomerang in my very first big American engagement, and I could have killed somebody. And so I learned a great deal from that experience.
It sounds to me like you're branded by some of these stories, especially if you're being requested to do the pin lady story or the boomerang story or whatever. How have these signature stories helped build your career?
Well, they've very much helped build my career because they've made me memorable, especially when people start saying, hey, that was that hula hoop lady. Let's have her back to the conference. They might not remember my name, and my name is quite difficult, McInnes-Smith, but they remember the hula hoop lady or the pin lady or the boomerang lady. And if I do one of those 3 signature stories, I will have very long-term recall.
Now, how do you choose your stories, like the boomerang thing that happened or the hula hoop thing that happened? Are you starting out with the story and then finding a point, or do you start out with a point and go in search of a story?
Well, in most of these cases, it was an experience, something that happened, like that I took the boomerang to the USA just to be Aussie. And, I also had a Kubras and oilskin jackets and didgeridoos and tapping sticks, and I literally went over the top. And I had no idea that I would throw the boomerang because I was literally just showing them the action. It was the crowd that started to chant and cheer me on and say, throw it, throw it. And of course I knew I wasn't going to throw it because I didn't want to admit I'd never thrown a boomerang. We just played with them, but we weren't throwing them because we knew that they were dangerous. And here I was standing on the stage feeling out of control, and the crowd was really whipping it up. And the next thing I knew, it just flew out of my hand. The whole crowd went dead silent. That was my story, and it went from there. The outcome, what happened, what I learned from it. Why can the crowd have that impact on our lives? How does the crowd influence our lives? So the experience literally brought lesson after lesson after lesson. And I love to recall it because it was my experience and it was unique to that particular event.
Now, it sounds to me like you took that experience and then went back and started to craft it and ask yourself, well, how can I use that and what would the point be? What was that process like? Over what period of time did it take to take that from concept to execution?
It probably only took 6 months for the story to be well developed, but I believe it took 5 years for it to be crafted into an expert piece. Because what happens, when I would tell the story, someone in the audience would have a unique response, something very comic, something very profound. And I always made note of what the audience fed back to me. And I believe some of the best learning points came from the audience and some of the best humour came from the audience. And I've collected that and made note of it over the years, continually honing, because sometimes you get a good piece, but then you get a better one. And I'm not scared to let go of the old and put in the new. And because most of us are trying to do something at a very high level of excellence, but in a very short amount of time. So because I'm a keynoter and I'm doing 45-minute presentations, I want to take out any superfluous words, any superfluous actions, anything that's extra, I want to bring it out. And therefore, sometimes you do it many times before you realize, there's 2 sentences there that I don't even need. And therefore, over time, some of the stories have definitely got better and better because we haven't ever taken for granted that's a good story. We've always said, what can we do to be better at what we do?
I preach that the magic of storytelling is in the details and in the texture, not just in getting to the point and skipping through everything so you can just get to the point, but actually having some fun along the way, allowing the audience to experience it. How do you determine what details stay in and what details are extraneous?
The details that paint the picture really clearly in their minds and lock them into being able to recapture the event must stay. The details that make them reflect on their own experiences and how that impacts them, because I'm not telling a story for the point of telling a great funny story. I'm telling it to teach them something that they keep. Therefore, with me, I need to ask the questions or make statements that bring forth their response. It's not entertainment alone. It's funny. And events, of course, that were tragic at the time can be very funny afterwards. But in this case, I truly need them to draw a profound lesson for themselves out of it, not just my lesson. Therefore, part of that practicing is, doing it with different ages. Because I also speak to teenagers as a personal mission, I find that teenagers give you different responses to my corporate audiences. And I learn a lot from them because they are harsher, they're more critical, they're less patient. And if the story works with a teenager, probably it's been honed down to its tightest. Adults will wait, they'll be patient, and they will allow you a little extra time. But the teenagers keep me sharp, and they don't care who you are or what you've done. You're as good as the presentation that they're hearing right now. So that locks me into do it well, do it sharp, and make the point as quickly as possible.
What happens when you've got a story that's very well developed? You've told it 50 times. You know that it works. You know exactly how to start it and where it goes and the language and the movement and the jokes. And you're in front of an audience they're just dead. They're just not giving you anything. But you know the story. do you allow that audience to affect you at all, or do you do the story, committed to doing the story the way that you know it works, trusting that they'll come around, and do they come around? What do you do with those bad audiences?
I don't get any bad audiences. And I want to say that my stories are short chunks. My stories are not very long. I have really synthesized them down to their meat. I can expand every story. And there are times when I'm with audiences where I know I can draw more out and take the story further. So if I've done a story a long time, I might do a lot more with it. But if I've got a difficult audience, or I think an audience that has really been sitting too long or has had too much dry content put at them, then I will be short, sharp, and I will make sure that I do one story backing onto another with a point in between. So really, the story itself doesn't change, only if it gets longer, and I can draw more from it, because I do believe that you can paint more, you tell more information, you can draw more of the circumstances and more about the characters in the story. So sometimes, the way I go is longer rather than shorter.
Great, thank you. Now, one of the questions a lot of people ask me is, how do you link your stories? How do you get from one story to another? Because there's that old formula of story, point, story, point. But the question is, but how do I get from the end of a point to the beginning of the next story? What is your secret?
All right. Even in my notes, you can see the link. I draw my notes. They are a sequence of pictures, small pictures down the left-hand side of the page. I always have notes prepared in that format because I hardly get to look at them, but that's my memory pattern. And because it's on the table with all my props and chocolates and goodies, if I need to, I can walk back and have a look at it. The link is already built into the story. My message, the finale is, I cannot arrive there unless I've traveled through all these links in the chain. And so if I want to cut a presentation short, I will take out, maybe 4 points from the beginning, but not just any 4, because everything is a sequence, one building on top of the other. And the stories have not been just put together accidentally. I have learned how does one point lead me to reinforce and make the next point more meaningful.
So it sounds to me like you really know exactly what you're doing strategically from moment to moment to moment, where you are, where you're about to be, where you were at every moment in your keynote. So it takes a lot of the chance out of the keynote. It takes a lot of the luck out of it. Am I correct in that assumption?
Yes, you are correct, but I must say that if I do my notes in pictures, you'll understand that sometimes I will have a plan A, B, and C, because I know me, but I don't know the audience until I'm in front of them. I take very careful briefings, but all of us know that sometimes the audience is nothing like what we've been told, and I go now with a plan A, B, and C. I have learnt that I can flick very quickly into another line of message if I feel that what my first preference isn't the most appropriate. So that really helps me because I've always got more than I need to talk about, and it means I've also got the sequence of the other options ready too.
Now, as a keynoter, I think it's very interesting because you said, I've only got 45 minutes and I've got a lot of material that I have to somehow compress into 45. What tip would you give about culling through all that material so you don't try and teach everything in 45 minutes?
My husband has been the best teacher on this because he has heard me speak hundreds and hundreds of times, and he takes notes after every presentation. Fortunately, he always tells me I've done a great job straight after the event and then tells me later what the feedback is that he shows me, because he's left brain and detailed, he really points out to me where I've said things that are unnecessary or I've gone down a rabbit track. And I think sometimes you don't even realize you've gone there because it seemed a natural flow, but of course it can rob you of being really effective and straight to the point if it's in a short keynote. So one of the main teachers is having someone feeding back to me all the time on what worked and what didn't. So that's according to every age. So it's everywhere I go, I've got someone helping me to refine.
Have you found that there's a trick that you use to discipline yourself when you're in front of the audience so that you don't go off into a tangent? Because I know it's so easy to just have that idea pop into your head. Do you have breaks? Do you have a transmission? Do you have something that says, Lisa, no, don't go there?
Yes. I can see my husband's face in the front row sometimes. Or I actually have things that happen. You know, there are some places going down the rabbit track is even better. So sometimes if I'm doing an all-female audience, I'm much more likely to follow that little offshoot because they love that spontaneous, they know it's happening just in the moment, they know that this is just for them. They love that. My male corporate audience more often would prefer that I've really covered the content, that I've made sure I've really delivered meat with the laughter. So I'm more likely in a youth or a female audience to experiment and go off to other tracks and mixed company too, because it's still different to the all-male audience. That's really what I grew up on, that corporate male, let's get to the point, but at the same time, we want it to be fun and enjoyable and we want to laugh a lot. So I do check with myself every now and again, almost look across the audience to see, are we really hitting the point?
In your career, how important do you believe the stories have been versus other content development or other kinds of things, research that you do? How important do you believe the stories have been to the growth of your career? Have they been foundational?
They have been the most significant part. Because I started off with content as a sports psychologist background, and therefore content and information and data and statistics, I loved being able to prove something. But the audience remembers how they feel, what they thought, how they responded, what atmosphere you left them with, and the stories connect them with me personally. And that's why I don't use anyone else's stories. I feel that when I used other people's stories, no matter how good they were, that limited my ability to really be at the top of my trade. The minute I switched to all my own stories, all my own experiences, things that changed my very essence of who I was and how I operated, I connected with the audience at a deeper level. They knew that I was authentic with them at that time, and they also felt like they knew me. I let them into my world, and therefore, once you're in people's hearts, you stay there.
That's interesting that you talk about your personal stories, because one of my mantras is that emotion is the fast lane to the brain. And if you're telling somebody else's story, you can't feel it. But if you're telling your story, you can feel it. Have you noticed that when it's your own personal story, you're more present with it while you're telling it?
There's no doubt, because even if the story is really old, like being born with my eye permanently closed, I can still feel how I felt when those kids constantly called me names. I feel it, and sometimes the emotion even rises up in you when you least expect it, and you can feel, past experiences. Or when my son fell out of our boat last year and went under the propeller, no one can tell that story like I can, because I'm a mother and my child's life could have been lost.
Does the story remain fresh every single time when it's your story? Do you still get that emotional hit, even though it's in varying degrees each and every time?
I think I do, because I've told my story about my eye in particular, probably more than anything else, because every high school group gets the story about my upbringing and how I felt about having a handicap and how the crowd labelled me. They relate to that, and I can see it in their eyes as I'm telling them my story, that straight away they connect to me. I think you can never get tired of telling a story that truly has made a difference to you and to others. Therefore, if it doesn't make a difference to you or to the audience, then maybe it's time to stop telling it.
Good advice. We've got a lot of listeners that are new to the speaking business listening to this interview. What advice would you give them about finding their stories and developing their stories? What process have you used?
Well, I probably used Jeannie Robertson's process that I learned a long, long time ago, where she would record things that happened to her and keep a note in a book and make sure that she might not be using it for a long time, but she had a note of the funny experiences that happened. I did the same thing. I would take a note and be more aware of what was happening around me. Little things, taxi trips, hotels, travel experiences, family events, family interactions that didn't work out so well. I just took a mental note of it and then I'd jot it down. Often you don't develop the story until you really want it, in my case. I never developed stories when I wasn't writing a presentation for somebody. But suddenly you're given a topic and a particular scenario in a company, and you can look back through your recorded experiences and you realize that experience relates to this current message. And then I take a lot of time to craft that story and I write it out in full. Everything that happened, all the details. I write it out as clearly and as descriptively as I can, and then I cut it to ribbons and I just take out the really main points of it, and then I will use that story in that next presentation.
Well, that's interesting that you say you write it out word for word. What do you do after you've written it out word for word? Do you start memorizing line by line, or does writing it in itself create the memorization process?
Writing it in itself locks it into me, but I do get the pen and slash through it once I've written the whole thing out in full and just highlight a pen. What's the key here? What's the key? What are the main points? What absolutely has to be said? And I will keep that full written out piece on file somewhere, because when I go back to want to look at that experience again, I might rewrite that story from another angle and not use any of the highlighted points that I've used for this presentation, but I might use 2 or 3 others that I didn't even touch on last time. So I don't ever throw the story away and just think, oh, that's the only thing that's come out of that story. Childbirth stories have their time and place. I've got children now that are grown up. You know, well, not totally, but my youngest is 11, so that was a long time ago, it seems now. But every now and again, I have an audience to whom that is incredibly relevant. They've got children 5 and under. And then I'll go back and I will reread the stories of what I wrote back then, so that I don't make up anything, but I remind myself of all the different specifics that happened that might be relevant to the story now.
How close to 100% replicable, if you were to say a percentage, is a story like your pin story or one of the stories you tell over and over? How close is it to exactly the same each time?
The boomerang story is refined to the point where I think I can tell it word for word. And I love the way it sounds word for word, and I get annoyed with myself and I don't get it just right because it's been refined well. The pin story, I play with it more because it's acting, it's showing, and I can be more playful with it, so I can do more things with my actions that don't lose the significance of it. The hula hoops, as I tell the story and use the prop, go totally different every time. I've never, I think, had 2 exact outcomes the same, because there's always a volunteer involved and you can never replicate what the volunteer will do. That's why I love volunteers, and that's why other people hate them, because you can't control them. I love it because I create the story on the spot, and that seems to be part of my gift, to be able to respond to whatever happens. I'll make the point according to what they do, not according to what I want.
You mentioned acting and showing rather than telling some aspects of your story. Now, I'm the story theater guy. Obviously, I'm the one who teaches people how to act out their stories. Talk to us a little bit about acting. How do you act out? What do you choose to act out?
I, by nature, am a girl that loves to dance. So I love movement and I love freedom. So it's very natural for me to speak with lots of movement. And I don't want to make that movement walking up and down the stage. I want to make that movement really purposeful, that complements the story and the point. So I have just learnt to literally act out the story, but just the small point parts of it that are relevant, such as when the boomerang goes over their head, I look up with a certain look on my face, and everyone in the audience tends to look up with me, because you work out which actions are really prime to getting them right there in that experience. And some things I will do with very large movements, like the hula hoop story requires large movement and large responses from the audience. But the pin story requires small movement and very slight modifications of what I do, both with face and body. And I just practice it, I believe, until I get it so that it works better.
Do you rehearse at home?
I rehearse in my head. I run through my presentation and I see myself going through stories, particularly when I'm wanting to add new links to stories and change the sequence of things. Sometimes I will open with my closing story. You know how you get in a pattern and you always use that particular story to close? I force myself not to stay in the pattern, and I experiment and open with the closing story to see what a difference it makes. And sometimes I have been astounded that you think what your finale is actually a fantastic place to start, and then you go from higher to higher, not knowing that you could even do that, until you start with that, what you think is your best content.
What mistakes can speakers make with stories? What assumptions can they make about stories that can get them in trouble?
That we're interested in their story. Sometimes people give a lot of detail about something that has no interest. I practice at dinner parties. I tell my stories to friends and kids, and I watch reaction. I do not use stories just flippantly, throw it out there. I want to know whether this story meets the mark, has an impact, has interest and entertainment value. I don't want to experiment on my paying audience. I love playing with them, with my friends and family, and really working out what's great fun and grabs you quickly. So I think people give you too much information sometimes and too much detail, and it's not needed or necessary, and the story doesn't even have a strong enough point to warrant it.
What is a good length for a story?
I don't think I'm the expert to answer that, but I do know that short, succinct story that's funny or poignant is wonderful and always valuable. And if you can do it in a longer version and make more points and make it more relevant to the mood in that audience, then great.
Do your bureaus, the bureaus that you work with, and the companies that hire you again and again or refer you, do they sell you and refer you based on stories as well as topics?
No, I don't think they do. I think they sell me based on personality. I'm a very bright, energetic, out there personality on stage, and I think that's what they remember. They know I can make the audience cry, and they know I can make the audience laugh, and they know that I'll take them on a journey. But sometimes you tend to sell people on that, what's the overall feel that's left at the end? My overall feel is high. I'm going to leave people high. There's always going to be a happy ending. Whoever's come and been a part of my presentation is going to be a hero. And they're more likely to sell on that than they are on the stories themselves.
What advice would you give to a speaker about developing a keynote around stories? Just basically, how do you build a keynote around stories?
I think the advice I would give is, firstly, they must know what their message is. Don't throw stories at a piece of paper if you don't know what the finish of your message is. I want people to be able to sit in a conversation like you and I are having and tell me, what is it you want to leave with the audience? What do you want the audience to think, feel, and do when they walk away from this? And have you thought that the component parts of your presentation are going to bring that ending?
Lisa, on behalf of all of the listeners, thank you so much.
Lisa stated that her stories have been the most significant part of her career development because her stories stimulate an emotional reaction and allow her audience to get to know her, to connect with her on a deeper level. While she started out with a mix of personal stories and stories from other sources, her career really took off, according to her, when she went only to personal stories. I want to talk to you about the scripting process, something that Lisa mentioned, how to write your stories. Lisa stated that she writes her stories out word for word and then goes to work editing them to get them just right.
While I didn't ask her how she writes or where she writes, I have a suggestion for you. I've learned from personal experience and also from working with hundreds of speakers on their stories that there's a danger in sitting down at your computer and writing your stories. The danger is that you write your stories the way you would write an article, with proper punctuation and correct sentence structure and grammar. The problem with that approach is that you don't talk that way. Stories need to sound like a conversation, like you're sitting across the table with someone or standing in someone's backyard at a barbecue, and all of a sudden you start telling a story. The story needs to sound conversational and spontaneous. It needs to capture your enthusiasm and energy. The process that I teach in story theater is called talk onto paper. In other words, talk out loud as you would if you were telling the story to a friend, and then transcribe the words that come out of your mouth without editing them at all. Now, you can either talk and type, or better yet, get a pad of paper or a digital audio recorder and walk and talk. That's right, walk around like you're telling the story. Talk the story out using movements and gestures, and either talk and then write onto your pad, or just talk and record the story into the little digital voice recorder. And then sit down and transcribe the recording. Now, I have to warn you, when you start transcribing your spoken word, you're going to be tempted to edit your grammar and use fancier words, better sentence structure. Don't. Do not try and make yourself sound better. More often than not, when I'm working with one of my students in the Story Theater Retreat, I'll be listening to them tell their story, and then kerplunk, out comes a sentence that just doesn't sound right. And every single time, it's because the sentence was written as if they were writing an article. It is so hard to undo all of your programming, your elementary school and high school and college grammar. But here's the thing. Writing a story to be spoken is very, very different than writing a story to be read. The great part about scripting your stories, as Lisa stated, is that by the time you're done, you've partially memorized your story. Then what Lisa does is she practices her story at dinner parties to see how it works, which brings me to my next point. Stop rehearsing the rough draft of your story in front of your paying audiences. Take a little bit more time, discipline yourself, learn how to discipline yourself to take a little bit more time to write out your stories and then rehearse them out loud and on your feet, do a little memorization, and then perform them in front of an audience and let the audience help you develop the story. Now, Lisa and Jeannie Robertson are very lucky. Their husbands travel with them and give them feedback. My wife, Deborah, is able to travel with me sometimes as well, and her feedback has made me a much better speaker. But what if you don't have a spouse in your suitcase? What if you're out there all by your lonesome? How do you get feedback? Here's a gold nugget for you that's helped me get feedback from the people who matter most, my audience members. You know how people come up to you after you're done speaking to thank you for coming? Well, here's the nugget. Don't let them get away with a simple thank you. Ask them one of these two questions. What did you hear today in my program that's going to stick with you? Or, what was the best idea you heard from me today? And you know what? They'll give you some wonderful and often very specific feedback. And you may be surprised, as I was, to find that the thing that they like best is different than what you like best. That's what Lisa meant when she said the audience helps you develop your material. They will help you. All you have to do is ask. So I want to end this segment with the question that Lisa asks herself and her clients when she's choosing what stories to tell in any given speech. Here's the question. What do you want the audience to think, feel, and do as a result of your program? To learn more about Lisa McInnes-Smith, remember she lives in Australia, visit her website at www.lisaspeaks.com or email her at lisa@lisaspeaks.com.
All right, well, that's it for this episode. If you feel that you learned something valuable today, something that you can use that will make your stories stick, stories that make you and your business memorable, marketable, and monetizable, there are 3 things I'd like you to do. First, click on the follow or subscribe button and leave a review wherever you listen. And second, share this podcast with your friends and coworkers, your email list, and on social media. And third, connect with me on LinkedIn. And when you're ready to get serious about taking your stories to the next level, or if you have an important speech, presentation, or TED Talk coming up, or if you want some guidance on how to make the transition to becoming a professional speaker, let's schedule your free 30-minute coaching session where we can get to know each other and see if we're a good fit. And as always, I'd love to hear from you with your questions and comments. Let me know that you're out there listening and learning. You can send an email with your questions, comments, and suggestions to Deborah@DougStevenson.com. That's Deborah, Deborah, @DougStevenson.com. Hey, thanks for listening. Until the next episode, I'm Doug Stevenson.